everybody. We're gonna start this today, and you'll notice by just my pacing and just the way that we'll engage our distinguished guest. He's too humble, so I'll keep this short. Dan, I know that you exercise a critical humility, but just want to begin by not just introducing Dr. Daniel Siegel, but praising him and honoring him, his work. Just an incredible and prolific writer, scientist, activist, human being. I can talk for hours on his work in the field of mental health, his groundbreaking contributions to the field of interpersonal neurobiology, which we may get into that in some detail. He's also a board member for the Garrison Institute and the executive director for the Mindsight Institute. He has lectured and taught extensively globally. He is also the advisor and one of the originators of the idea of the Garrison Institute Fellowship. And I'm the inaugural director of the fellowship. We have 11 incredible thinkers, feelers, artists, scientists who are part of that 11, those 11 people. And it's been an honor to facilitate that experience. And so you'll begin to see more programming from our fellows in the coming months. This is our second fellowship forum, and it's really an opportunity for us to curate some of the conversations that are happening internally with the fellows. We meet once a month for about 4 hours, and we have just incredible conversations. And now we're beginning to strategically roll out a series of experiences for you all, for the community, because it's really for you all that we're doing this work. So this is our second forum. We have one next month with Arawana Hayashi. I'll tell you more about those forums later. We have one with Aja Marie Brown in April, with Michael Eric Dyson in April, with Bayo Akomolafe in May. So we're going to be curating some high-powered conversations in a way that it's accessible, that you feel like you can actually engage our scholars. Without further ado, I want to invite Dr. Siegel to share some opening remarks. And before I hand it over to you, Doc, this notion of intra-connection, very interesting. This notion of dispelling the lie of a separate self, very interesting. I mean, we all know here that we are in an interesting situation, globally, locally, ecologically, politically, and we can theorize about that all day. But what I really want to do today is create the opportunity for Dr. Siegel to bless us with some of his thinking, and then wrestle with him a little bit. We'll once he's done with this introductory remarks, him and I will have a little back and forth, just a little bit, and then it'll be us and him, almost like a fireside chat on Zoom, Brady Bunch style. And then about an hour in, if it makes sense for us to do a little break or have a little bit of a bio break, we'll do that. And then we'll give you an opportunity, if you so choose to break out into smaller groups and have just a little bit of conversation with each other around, how is this landing? Is it making sense? Do we need to push back? Do we need to get some clarification here? And then we'll come together and process even more. So that's what I'm hoping to do today, as holding the space for us. Dr. Siegel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Acosta. And you can call me Dan, so we can make this really informal. And again, I want to echo your thanking Monique and Elizabeth, and really it's an honor to be here with the Garrison Institute. And Dr. Acosta, I want to really just honor you with the incredible leadership you have for this wonderful GI fellowship. The Garrison Institute is honored to have you take this leadership role, and along with Jennifer Bloom, to really be weaving together some very powerful ways where these wonderful 11 fellows are bringing together stuff. And I think you may meet some of them here today. So very brief comments. I'll just say, the topic for today is the notion of intra-connection. At the Garrison Institute, we've been really building on the wisdom of interconnection, the connection between things, and the realization that nature is filled with interconnections that unfortunately in modern times we often overlook, and we overlook them to the detriment of all life on Earth. And so at the Garrison Institute, our basic stance is three things need to be woven together. One is this wisdom from contemplative practices of all sorts, indigenous wisdom teachings. So I right now am speaking to you from Tongva land here in Los Angeles. There are, each of us in North America have been given the opportunity, often through terrible atrocities to indigenous peoples. And so to begin there, we want to honor that from a deep way in Garrison. We want to honor the indigenous wisdom that comes from both indigenous peoples, but also from contemplative practices that inform us. So the wisdom that's there, and there's a beautiful video that I learned from Dr. Acosta. I think, what is it called, Angel? It's the wise elders speak or something like that. It's
yes. I'll share that with the community.
Yeah. So when you listen to all these elders from around the world, you see that indigenous teachings have taught what in Buddhist practice has been taught for 2,600 years. And so basically this perennial or perpetual wisdom we get is that we are all deeply interconnected. And the word interconnection implies that there's one thing here that's connected to another thing there and another thing there and another thing there. And they make a web of, what Thich Nhat Hanh would call interbeing, or you could call it interdependent or interlaced, with the inter word meaning a betweenness. And I was once working with some people through the Garrison Institute, Peter Sangay and Otto Scharmer and Mette Bol. These are people who work through MIT. And we went up to a place called The Way of Nature with John P. Milton. And Milton is a wonderful teacher who was trained initially in environmental science, wrote one of the first papers in the late 60s, warning about the dangers of carbon emissions. And then he went on a journey to learn meditative practices across many traditions, indigenous traditions. And there we were learning these traditions from him. And part of it was to go out in the woods for 3 days on our own. So you could call it alone time. But when the dozen of us that were working together in this systems awareness program came out of that experience, we tried to articulate what it was like. And all of us had a very similar experience when we were by ourselves, which was that we were not by ourselves. In fact, the creek near this body, the trees, the sky, the clouds, the hills, the animals that came by, they were all a part of one whole. So when I was speaking around this little group we had, I just couldn't find the word. So the word intra-connected came out of this body. I said, that's the only word I can think of, because it really wasn't interconnected. There was no more something here connected to something there. It was a wholeness to it. So that led me on a journey years ago to try to see what is this thing called self? How does it relate to something we can talk about today called identity? And then a related process of belonging. And so we'll talk about those three things: self, identity, and belonging. And I was very deeply honored that in trying to put a book together about this, I asked some people actually to do a strange thing, to participate in a pre-book book club. So I hadn't written the book yet, but I wanted to talk to certain people that I had met along the journey of life. So I brought them together, and ultimately it's this group that many of them became actually fellows. So they've been on this journey as a whole, and this is where the interconnected word came out. One simple thing I'll just say from that experience in the woods is that someone in the group got very lonely, and she chose to leave her separate space and go wandering to try to find someone. And she ran into me. So in the midst of being at one with the forest, I hear my name called out, Dan, Dan, Dan. And she comes by, and I'm like shocked into this different space of being. Within moments, this identity of Dan in this body comes back, and I could hardly speak. So I finally found the words as she's trotting off to go find other people to say, no, 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 you can't do that. You're supposed to stay in your own space, not going down the trail to find the other people's spaces. Anyway, so she said, oh, you mean I have to stay by myself? I said, well, that's the whole point. And so she went back, and it took another maybe 8 to 10 hours before probably the default mode network in my brain, which is the midline set of circuits that probably mediates a sense of a separate self. It isn't all that it does, but that's one of the things it does when it's overactive. I could feel it almost relax. And then instead of having the illusion, what E.O. Wilson calls an illusion of separation, or what Einstein called a delusion of consciousness, an optical delusion of consciousness of separation, that dissolved away after these 8-10 hours. And then I was again in this intra-connected state where there was a body, but there was also a relationality, and they were like in this flowing continuum that I would simply use the term me plus we equals mui. There was a mui quality to it. And yes, as Joanna's saying, it's the power of silence. And, in doing this practice called the wheel of awareness, when people get into the silence of the hub of the wheel and distinguish that from all the sounds you can get metaphorically and literally on the rim, this silence, this source of awareness, is something I was able to study independent of this forest experience with tens of thousands of people, sometimes at the Garrison Institute. And we can talk about that, about what pure awareness, what is silence, and what does it mean in terms of what our experience in life really is. So I'll just say 1 minute's worth, Angel, and then bring these conclusionary comments to these introductory comments to a conclusion that go like this. If you say the mind is an emergent property of energy, which in this little home office is the only way I could make sense of, what our mental experience might be, then you realize skull nor skin are impermeable boundaries that would block or impede energy flow from happening. So it's happening, yes, in your body right now as you hear these words, but it's happening now between your body and the screen, because now we're on Zoom. But it's going to happen among all of our bodies in these few hours that we have together now. And this emergent property of energy, then we can study in a systems sense and even explore a proposal of the source of awareness being when this energy, which scientists say is the movement from possibility to actuality, is in this space of possibility, what physicists call a quantum vacuum or sea of potential, this generator of diversity, this what they say is formless source of all form, is that silence that Joanna is referring to. And then it's from that generator of diversity that all actualities arise. And so if you can drop into that plane of possibility, then you're given the opportunity to drop out of your default mode network, just talk about the brain, and into a space of awareness where what you might call self, which we can get into, actually expands. So it's not the loss of a self. And this is, what people who are trained in certain traditions say, oh, there is no self. Any story about the self is a lie. And I don't think that is that helpful, because you do have a body. It's just a truth. You have a body. So there's a self experience from the within, the me, but there's also a self, if you define it as a center of subjective experience or sensation, perspective or point of view, of agency or a center of action that spells the word spa. If you just define a self as being a center of the spa, then in fact you can have a self that's centered in the body from that subjectivity, perspective, and agency, but you also have a self that's the forest. And that is as much you as your bodily self. There's a relational self that's as much you as the bodily self. So it's not that the self disappears. I think that would be an extremist view that scientifically doesn't really make sense, but the self expands. And if we could then have a narrative that included that in modern times, we would have a totally different approach to social justice, to environmental protection, to the polarization we see, and even to the way we approach the viral pandemic, so that you can make an argument that those four pandemics, social injustice, environmental destruction, polarization and misinformation, and even the virus, could be effectively dealt with by looking at the fifth pandemic, which is this lie of the separate self we can just call the solo self, not denying that you have an internal aspect to experience, but to say that if you think that that's the whole of yourself, then that's where the lethal lie comes from, because it's leading to all these other pandemics with massive destruction. So I'll leave it there, Dr. Acosta. And those are just some preliminary ideas to get us going and see what you think.
Yeah. You can call me Angel. You can call me Angel or Angel. You want to
That
call
sounds like a song. You can
my.
call me Angel in the morning.
So let's take a moment to settle into what Brother Dan just shared. For some of us, that might be a lot. So allow me to just mirror back to you what I heard and maybe what I didn't hear, and maybe you can respond. We'll go back and forth a couple rounds, and I know that we have a couple fellows here: Zara, Nico, Barnaby, Nicole, and Jackie. So I want to put you on the spot. So if anything comes up for you, I'll invite you to come and share. And then community, I want you to start getting ready to contribute. Brother, I want to thank you for acknowledging the role of indigenous wisdom in this process. You allude to the quantum vacuum, you allude to science, and we appreciate those traditions. And we know that a lot of what quantum physics is pointing to is things that wisdom traditions have known for a very long time. Specifically, I think about when you say mui, a me and a we. I think about, I know Dr. Fania Davis is here with us, and she's spent a significant amount of time in the African continent. This notion of Ubuntu, I am because we are, because you are. So there is this long-standing tradition of interconnection in many of our communities. And I think that your work is really insightful now to kind of surface a lot of that. And you mentioned the interbeing, almost that generative, what Senge and those colleagues of ours call a generative social field. That even here, we're all in our respective homes or in our respective places, in our Zooms, yet there is a field that's forming right here. And there is, even if you don't see it, there's a generative social field that is almost vibrating right now together. We're building something here. And I just appreciate you bringing the word consciousness into the conversation as well. So my question primarily is twofold. One is somewhat historical, which you don't necessarily need to pay attention much in terms of the classic Western challenge of mind-body dualism and the ways in which the Cartesian logic has set us up to have this split between mind and body, and how that split still sits with us today, not just in how we carry research, but how we engage each other and how we even process emotions, where we tend to disassociate from our bodies, and how that disassociation creates the conditions for us to be less empathetic, less compassionate, increasing discrimination, increasing xenophobia. So that's one dimension of the question. And then another question, which is related, is in light of that challenge of having this notion of a separate self, of us maybe even being part of an in-group, and in that process, whether it be in-group as human and nature over there, or whether it be a process of in-group creating and white folks over here, and through that construction of whiteness, unfortunately, creating a system that reinforces othering, and in many cases, historically, extracting of labor from others. So, and then now with polarizing politics, and I'll stop here. How can we lean into this notion of interconnection to just allow us at least to kind of come a little closer to each other?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Angel. And let's just take a moment to really pause and think about what Dr. Acosta, what Angel is saying, because the implications are huge. Even though what we're going to talk about today may sound really simple, its implications are huge. So let's just start with, for example, the moment of 1619, when people of European descent descended on the continent of Africa and took human beings from their families, bought them, and put them on ships and brought them to North America. Now, think about, let's talk about the individual. The individual carrying out that act would need to have some kind of neural process, just talk about that person's brain, where unlike how they might treat their mother or their daughter, where they would have these midline circuits of empathy first, to feel another person's feelings, to take on the other person's point of view, called perspective taking, to understand that person's mental experience, cognitive understanding or cognitive empathy, to take pleasure in their joys, empathic joy, and to have empathic concern. These 5 aspects of empathy, right? Emotional resonance, perspective taking, empathic understanding, empathic joy, and empathic concern. So that if they had those empathy circuits going, these are midline circuits in the brain, they would look at a person in front of them in Africa and say, I can't do this to this person. I wouldn't do this to my mother. I wouldn't do this to my brother. I wouldn't do it to my daughter. I'm not doing this. They would see the humanity in the other, in quotes. I don't like that word other, but they would see the other not as an other. They would see the person as a human being like me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, once you get the activation of empathy circuits, for 98% of us anyway, you activate the circuits of compassion. So then you do 3 things that Paul Gilbert talks about. 1, you feel the other person's suffering. 2, you imagine what you might do to reduce that suffering. And 3, you take action to reduce that suffering. So empathy and compassion for most human beings go together. You have some Buddhist monks who are trained to have pure compassion without empathy, and that's fine. But for the most part, for most of humanity, you must have empathy as a gateway to compassion. I know people are bad-mouthing empathy, but I think it's a misunderstanding of the research. Anyway, so that's to say that these circuits in the brain are responsive to basically saying who's in the in group, who's in the out group. I can turn these circuits on if you're in my in-group, if you're like me, and however I define like me, and I can turn them off if I'm a Nazi running a concentration camp and I'm nice to my wife and I'm nice to my kids, I can go to Majdanek in Poland and I can burn 500,000 bodies that I've just gassed because my brain sees them as the out group and I see them as just pieces of dirt to stick in the rubbish bin. So we need to realize, unfortunately, the human brain has probably a 50 million year history of in-group, out-group distinctions that developmentally for the individual, we see kids manifesting this by 14 months of age. Who's like me, who likes my preferences for cereal, for example, who doesn't. I'll treat people who are similar to me nicely. I'll treat people not similar to me harshly. So unfortunately, it's not just learned. It's probably built into our human DNA. So now when you talk about consciousness, Angel, the only thing that's going to save us, I think, is consciousness. So when people like Joanna Macy, a dear friend and colleague, when she beautifully teaches us about a wider self and a revolution, quantum leap in consciousness is what she talks about. This quantum leap in consciousness, I think, is to drop beneath, in our frame, what we call plateaus and peaks of separation, where I'm doing this automatic, genetically determined, socially sanctioned, mentally constructed thing of race and racism. And I learn how to use consciousness to drop beneath those divisions so I can see from this space of open awareness that, in fact, I am you. You are me. We have bodies that are different, but we treat each other with incredible love because love is what comes out of that space. And that is love for other human beings that we may not think are similar to us because their skin color is different, or their beliefs are different, or their nationalities are different, or whatever. But it's also other species. This is where social justice and environmental protection are based on the same fundamental process of realizing how intra-connected we all are. There's a wholeness to reality that's even more than interconnection. It's an intra-connection that dissolves this lethal lie of the separate self that says your self, yes, is within your body, and it's within all bodies, and it's with all living things, and maybe within all of reality. You are the universe is not an overstatement when you think of the self as having this wider expanse.
Yeah, man, I love talking to you, man. I wish the pandemic was over. Let me just, I want to get the audience involved here, because I get to talk to you often. So I just want to slow us down a little bit because you bring such expertise in terms of science, and I'm almost like, as you're talking about these biomolecular processes, I'm just like, whoa, what does it mean what does it mean to have a switch turned off in my brain that down regulates my compassion, allowing me to be exploitative? It's a very provocative thing to think about, especially with the reality that we're facing. And by the way, when you talk about wholeness, it reminded me of Parker Palmer and his whole notion of a hidden wholeness. So there is some interesting connections here. So I'll just say this, and as I say this, my folks, my people, start to think about if you want to contribute to the conversation in whatever way you want in the chat. We'll call on you in a minute so we can spend time with Dan. So Dan, there are a couple things for me that kind of not trouble your contribution in theory, because I love wrestling what you're saying. On the one hand, the situation where one of the many situations we're dealing with right now is the proliferation of data and information in our lives. And with that proliferation, there is a manipulation of facts. And that's a fact. And with that, there is the expansion and fostering of conspiracy theories and all kinds of ways of reasoning and rational, believing in things that just aren't the case, aren't true, leading to possible even insurrections of our own capital. So I love this notion of interconnection. I love this idea of thinking about our brains as these neurochemical processes that you can kind of switch on and off things, and consciousness. So and just hold this, and then we'll invite the audience to come in. Is, if consciousness is one of the levers to create some kind of change right now, then how do we upregulate compassion, especially in relationship to some of the most polarizing topics that are in our landscape right now? That's the juicy question for me. Is if consciousness is the lever, then how? Because it just feels like there's so much division, there's so much in-group formulation right now that folks are talking over each other. And unfortunately, the reality is that talking over each other is violent. It's violent, and it has to be named. I'll stop there, and if anything is coming up for you in regards to what I just said there, we can hold it. Yep.
Well, yeah, I'd like to respond to what you're saying, and then if there are any specific, if you want to start our group gathering discussion, I'm really excited to do that. But let me respond to these powerful things you just said. Take it one step at a time, and I want to apologize if I'm going too fast, because this stuff feels so important and timely in terms of what we're going through, that I get a lot of energy inside of me about it, and it can come out kind of fast, as if I'm from New York, not from California. So I want to slow down. But the second thing to say is, let's just take a step back and say that, if experience equals energy flow, okay, and energy flow can be constructed into information, right? So that, if I say blah, 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 it's pure energy. If I say good morning, that's a formation of energy that has a symbol of something. It's a greeting, right? So let's just start there, that energy can be pure energy, or it can be in a formation that we call information. And then it's symbolizing something. And since it's changing, it's called flow. So we're going to have a phrase, energy and information flow, for what experience is. So we rapidly have this process of constructing energy into categories, concepts, and symbols, right? And soon we live socially with the symbols we share, the forms of communication we have, that can create racism, right? That can create holocausts and genocide. It can, so that's all mentally constructed, that is humanly constructed within the individuals, and how it's shared. So that's social construction. So even just the discussion of racism that Ibram Kendi invites us to do, or Isabel Wilkerson, and looking at caste, they're beautifully and powerfully and importantly talking about the human construction of racism to follow the following evolutionary path, which is what I wanted to address to what you just said. The human mind is called, the human brain, actually, let's distinguish this, but the mind in part is emerging from the brain, but it's also emerging from our relationships. So part of the mind is from the brain, and the brain is called an anticipation machine. And what that means is, it's the way it survived. We've had, 500 million years of evolution in our vertebrate history. We've had 200 million years of history as mammals. We've had over 50 million years of history as primates. And for our specific species, we've only been around, some people would say, a few 100,000 years. Some people would say 60,000 years. So let's just say somewhere around 100,000 years. That's not that much time, right? So what we know from primate history is that we do this thing called in-group, out-group distinguishing. That's a real problem. What it means is that our brains, as anticipation machines, are going to get ready for the immediate next of now. So it's hard to live in the present moment because we're always trying to predict, because the certainty with the predictive process gives us a feeling of security, that we're going to have safety. Right. So it all comes down to, am I safe or am I in danger? Am I safe or am I in danger? Am I safe or am I in danger? So prediction then says, okay, if I can predict your behavior, Angel, because you're in my in group, I'm safe. But if I think you're in my out group, I can't predict your behavior. You might hurt me. You might not, but you might. So I can't trust you. Right. So whatever criteria I might end up using to determine in-group, out-group membership is going to shape how I treat you. And the studies on something called mortality salience or terror management, same kinds of studies, show that if I'm in a state of threat, I'm going to increase my in-group, out-group distinction process. I'm going to try to figure out, are you like me or not like me? Are you similar to me, not similar to me? And interestingly and terribly, if I'm under threat, I'm going to increase that process and treat the people I deem as in the in-group more kindly, and treat the people in the out-group more harshly. It's just an amazing finding, and an important finding. When you add that finding to the study in the brain, you asked about the brain for a moment, literally you can show in incredible studies out of Dartmouth, and other places now, that if you show a picture of someone and say there's things that make them like you, you activate your circuits of empathy that are the gateway for the compassion circuits. But if you make a little sentence where this person is no one you can relate to, like they like, I don't know, Barbie dolls and cleaning oil off of, garage repair shops, nothing really terrible, but just, I don't like Barbie dolls. I don't like cleaning oil off of garage car repair shops. You shut off your circuits of empathy. Now you add to that, if I think you're not like me, not in my in-group, and I'm under threat, and I get into a fight, freeze, reaction. I can run away in fear. If I flee, I can shut down and faint, or I can fight you. If I'm activating the fight response, I could see you as a non-human and kill you, which unfortunately I think explains, sadly, doesn't excuse, but it explains the horrible killing of people of color, especially Black men, by police officers, often white police officers. This process is so fast and so deep, it turns on these automatic practices where if someone's trained and has a gun, it's way, way beneath and before consciousness or choice. This is terrible, So all of this stuff put together says, we as humans, if we don't use consciousness to try to make a change in destroying each other in caste systems and racism, that Kendi and Isabel Wilkerson, powerfully teach us about, where we dehumanize people, or if we don't use it for the environment and realize other species, in quotes, other, are actually us, then life on Earth, because of this problem of the human mind to create these in-group, out-group distinctions, that's what we mean by the term the lethal lie of the separate self. Separate can be singular, like I'm alone in this body, but separate can mean this race is better than that race. So it's a plural separate self, or it can be this human species is separate from all species.
Thank you, Dan. And I appreciate that.
Say that, I'm a white identified individual. And I can say too that, with the name Dan or the way I appear, I'm male in my sex assigned at birth, and I'm a cisgender male. You could say that. So then you would say, well, okay, Dan lives in the majority. He's got, his sexual orientation, his gender identity, his skin color and racial identification. He's like in the majority. So we need to be aware that his point of view is living in a white dominant country like the United States. And that's got to be the perspective, which is absolutely right. We gotta acknowledge that. Now, at the same time, then the question that Drew's asking is, what happens when you're a white individual, especially a white male, where there aren't, what Teilhard de Chardin would call a noosphere, an atmosphere of information that is what Wilkerson would describe as a caste, where we say it's a white supremacist nation, a white dominant caste system called America, where if you're a person of color, you are in the caste perspective, a subordinate caste. And then if you're a white identified person, you're in the what's called dominant caste. So that would then give me a certain positionality where I could have the situation where I wouldn't even have to think about these things. So when I talk to my white identified friends, some of them will say, well, there's no such thing as, really being white. And what is all this talk about racism? It's not really real, is it? And I go, did you really just say that? And they go, yeah, well, what's the big deal? I mean, everyone's got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and this kind of thing. And I'm like, and maybe it's because, every week there's a MWE council that meets, and many of them are here on this call. And we as a group have the experience, being half people of white identifiedness, half BIPOC folks, half people of color, where we have worked through this stuff. And my friends, for the most part, who are white, do not have interactions, as you're saying, with people who aren't white. So then you go, wow. So let's look at Drew's question just briefly, and then we'll open it up, Angel. But the question is then, what happens when you have a white dominant culture and you have people who are white identified who aren't being given the privilege, the opportunity, the real honor of actually communicating across what is the socially constructed experience of race? Because as we know, biologically, they're just population variations, but race is a social construction that is born from the experience of racism, which was basically an attitude to say one race is better than the other. And for most white dominant situations, it's saying the white race, which is actually an illusion, is better than the Black race. And these are constructed for the purpose of domination. So if you're a white person, even though I can say, well, my relatives were slaughtered for 2,000 years, millions of them killed, but I had white skin, so I got a free pass in this country. Not just a free pass from being seen as a subordinate grouping in a white dominant world, but I could pass as a dominant person, even though I don't even feel internally that I'm a dominant person in this country, the United States. But you wouldn't know it because I have this color skin. So this gives me a privilege to not have to think about these things. And I think Drew's point is exactly right, that we need to find ways of cultivating these conversations for there to be any progress in the world, let alone in this country, across these polarizations that you talk about, Angel, of people just isolating themselves in information bubbles where they just keep on reaffirming their own point of view rather than seeing the human being that's in front of them that might not look like them, but that they share tremendous amounts with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. And I'm going to stack the question. And Drew, reach out to me directly, because we may be able to organize another forum where we get into that very meaty question. And because even in this moment, I love what Dan just said, but I have some like jujitsu like responses.
Well, let's do it. Angel, go. Let's do.
Well, let's do it, Dan. No. I won't do it, Dan. I want to hear everybody else. I will say one thing though to what you said, Dan. Everything you said, powerful. I would just add that there is growing evidence that everything that you said is true, plus the tentacles, the ideological one and the institutional one of white supremacy, are actually impacting our Earth system.
Or what?
Our Earth system, our global system.
Yeah.
And I put a link to the article on the impact of white supremacy on our Earth system, because it's important that, yes, on one hand, we understand that, you know, we're racialized and that race is a social construction. And at the same time, we got to reckon with that social construction has created a material reality that we are now reckoning with. And so I'll stop there. Look at the article. Drew's going to reach out. We're going to have another forum on this. Chris Smith.
Hi, I'm just on audio. Dan, I really want to say that I so appreciated the pep talks last year. They really helped get me through that year. So thank you. I was just really struck by what you were saying about a heightened sense of threat sort of engages that wiring in the brain of in-group, out-group, makes it more exaggerated. And it really helps me to understand some of the insanity of our political atmosphere. I think it really just jacked everything up. And it really made sense to me how the things change so fast, you know, with Black Lives Matter in the summer. So many people from so many backgrounds joined those protests, and yet something happened, it seemed like, and then there was this backlash. And I think it came from that sense of threat of defund the police, that somehow that engaged that brain, you know, so that white folks then suddenly backed off from their support. And I that's how I can understand now how Trump got so many votes. So there's that. But the question I have is, it came up in the chat from Dana. How do we engage consciousness to, what would you call it? Transcend the in-group, out-group wiring? Or I don't know even how you would think about it, but where does that change come from? What can we do to engage that?
Yeah. Now, Angel, do you want me to respond to Chris's question, or what's your sensibility of that? Because I have a lot to say about what Chris just said.
I know. If you can briefly give, because what's going to happen, Chris, is that the other questions will connect, and we'll have time in the latter half of the next hour to really go deeper. But I think this merits a quick response. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I had the deep privilege of working with the late Congressman Elijah Cummings, and in Baltimore. And Elijah and I would do these workshops. And in one workshop, we did this practice called the Wheel of Awareness, where at the beginning of the workshop, we had people who were white identified, people who were Black identified, who were in the room with a huge amount of tension. They had never met with each other before. And for the most part, they didn't have the opportunity to meet across the racial divide like Drew is asking us to do. And so we did the Wheel of Awareness practice. And when people got into the hub, which represents pure awareness, and then they came out of the practice and shared their experience, there was an absolute shift in the room that the individuals could articulate as basically letting go of the tension of separation and the tension of you're not like me because you have Black skin or white skin, and, you know, dropping into a space which not only had a sense of connection and awareness, this hub, but it had a sense of love. So Elijah Cummings was just blown away that in a small little practice, in the safety of a room, for sure, it was a workshop of invited participants, so it wasn't like global public, but you could see that people could do the work of consciousness to access a space of awareness where love, connection, and open presence, if you will, open awareness, seemed to be like three threads of a singular tapestry of life. And my hope is that as we go forward as a humanity, that we can see a way of dissolving the toxin of white supremacy, of dissolving the toxicity of colonialism, which are all driven by this in-group dominance, state of mind that doesn't have to be the pervasive state of mind of our shared humanity. It does not have to be. It may be more like a vulnerability and a part of our development as a species that consciousness, when people talk about the revolution of consciousness or, quantum change in consciousness, to allow this wider self, we can talk about the quantum aspects of it, if you will, but in simple terms, it's a way of letting go of the noun-like clinging to what Rashid, the artist who's got a quote in the Brooklyn Public Library entry, talks about the flimsy fantasy of certainty that she talks about that we need to let go of. And amazingly, consciousness itself is correlated with the maximal amount of uncertainty when you look at this energy profile. So in a way, we have to give people the strength to drop into that maximal uncertainty where awareness arises, let go of the false security that comes from clinging to a noun-like illusion of separate identities, and then let love happen through you. And, this, I'm speaking as a scientist here. This may overlap with indigenous teachings, with poets, what they say, with spiritual teachings, whatever. This is just offering from a science perspective how love is actually the fuel that gets released when you drop out of these illusions of this separation. This lethal lie of the separate self drains you of love.
Thank you so much for that. And we'll stack the questions and remarks right now. And I promise we'll weave them together and so Christina Bowen, please.
Hi, I think
some responses to each of the questions that came up, but you heard all the questions, you heard all the comments. What is present for you right now? How would you like to respond, brother? I know you probably read a book to respond to all those questions, but what's coming up for you?
Well, I really want to hear from everybody else, Angel. That's what's coming up with me. I love the idea of stacking, and I love the idea of collective intelligence. I love the idea that we should let the system of life on Earth and the natural portal of integration that arises through this plane of possibility that emerges through these bodies. The one thing I would just say is just love. I mean, I feel so honored to be here with everybody. And I hope that just what you're saying, people really hear that this is the beginning, not the end of a conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation. So, I know in the breakout that I had, it was just absolutely beautiful, and it kind of was meant to be, and then if we can contribute that now, and as you're so beautifully guiding us, Angel, the future fellow forums can be just a continuing conversation like you might have with your best friend, because this is, the inside out view of change on the planet is going to come when it comes from a place of love and presence and connection that I think this kind of forum literally can facilitate. So I'll just say that. That's all I'll say. And I'm happy to address anything specifically, but I really want to hear from everybody.
Yeah. So what I'll do is just to I'll do 1 minute of just weaving the questions that came up. From Noemi, from Drew, from Christina, from Charlene, from Gary, Zara, this question of what do we do? What do we do? What are the experiences that we need to create and cultivate to foster interconnection? What are the palpable ways in which we can actually move forward? One, from Gary, this notion of how do we make this more complex in terms of understanding that there are several dimensions to interconnection, a horizontal one in terms of our social relations. And like, for example, this event here, fostering the horizontal interconnection between us, coming from all places around the world to have this conversation, resonating with the wisdom of Dan and also the wisdom of the collective, but also what does it mean to connect to some kind of vertical interconnection with maybe a divine source or universal, some kind of energy there, whatever that is, to be identified by the individual or by the collective. Sister Christina, begging the question of, I'm in these processes that allow that I see how white supremacist structures and behaviors are reinforced, and oftentimes difficulty arising with people having challenges with dealing with change. What do I do? Again, the question, what do we do? Drew with the question of racialization, and how racialization and racism are so deep in our society that it impacts how we have this conversation. So we must attend to race, and we must attend to gender and other ways in which we tend to otherize people. And I'll just close with two things. This notion of consciousness. Zara King talks about the calcification around identity. This is who I am. These are my people. You're over there. Stay. That calcification, that rigidity. Again, what do we do, Dan? How do we soften those boundaries? I hear that love is a response. Love is an answer. And then I'll close out in terms of any weaving. Trust. What is the methodology of trust that we need for this 21st century? What are the practices, rituals, experiences that not just foster trust, but penetrate us so deeply that even in front of our enemies, we extend the curiosity to understand where they're coming from? I'll stop there. We'll open it up to the community. Dana, keep coming back to these forums. We measure the quality of what we're doing depending on the proximity of our relationship to each other and the quality of our trust, at least in this community and in the others where we're connected to. So just keep coming back, please. Dan, I do want to, I like closing with just a little bit of just closing remarks. So would you take a minute just to share what's on your heart, and then I will close us out, please?
Absolutely, absolutely. First of all, thank you everyone who's commented. I'm just filled with incredible gratitude and inspiration. Just to build on the last really powerful invitation that Nico, you've invited us to consider. I also resonate with that notion, not so much of doing, but of being. And in the being, you know, as a scientist, I'll just say this, that if you listen deeply to all the words that have been spoken today from all of us together, from a science point of view, there is a process of linking differentiated parts that we're just going to name as integration. And that in a way we drop into being within that hub of the wheel, within that plane of possibility, which becomes the portal through which integration can arise. So we don't need to do anything to make integration happen, yet we need to be responsible for being in such a way as to remove the blockages to integration, which mean that we honor the differences that have been highlighted here. We don't just tolerate them, we thrive because of diversity. And the linkages come from kindness and compassion, right? So integration made visible is kindness and compassion. It's how love expresses itself. And so to bring the science to link with the deep indigenous teachings of spiritual wisdom is a moment of being fully present, whether you call that vertical intraconnectedness that then inspires horizontal interconnectedness. It's all about integration inside and out. And this has been just a beautiful forum. I want to give a shout out to Dr. Angel Acosta for setting a space for all of us to begin a conversation together, but to continue a conversation into the present moments that will come in these settings of the forum. So Angel, thank you so much. And I want to thank everybody. It's been just incredibly inspiring.
Yes. So let me close by inviting you back to our forum. Check out our offerings by our fellows. And I'll just add one little thing about what happens when we're in community in this kind of way. Look, 2 hours passed and it felt like we were together for a week. There's something about the ways in which we can engage in community in this way that literally time dilates. So just want to say that I feel like, yes, 2 hours, but I feel like I've been here a whole day and I feel connected to you all. Let's all unmute ourselves if we can and say goodbye in whatever form you'd like. I'd love to hear voices as we leave. Take good care, everybody. Take good